You're not Clara.
Sorry, what? Wait, this isn't gate 17?
She was 30,000 feet in the sky before realizing she'd boarded the wrong plane. Not a cheap commercial flight, a billionaire's private jet. Now he's staring her down. Furious? Curious? No one stopped her. No one asked questions. Because they thought she was his assistant. But she's not. She's a nurse, burnt out, broke, and completely trapped. And the man across from her? Donald Schwardzeneger, the tech tycoon with more enemies than friends. He should have thrown her off the jet. Instead, he leans in and says, "I have a proposal. Would you say yes to a billionaire's mistake? Because this one might change everything." The life she'd left behind was one built on predictability. Shifts at Mercy General, bills on the fridge, and the quiet understanding that her dreams had been postponed indefinitely to care for her ailing mother. It was a life of service, not of private jets and intimidating billionaires. The initial heart-pounding panic had subsided, leaving behind a raw, shaky embarrassment. Donald Schwardzeneger had not called security. He had not raised his voice. He had simply taken the seat opposite her, his sharp, assessing gaze making her feel like a fascinating, if perplexing, specimen. "Let's start from the beginning," he said, his voice a low, steady counterpoint to the jet's muffled roar. "You're a nurse. You were headed to Charlotte. Tell me why." The question, delivered with the calm intensity of a CEO in a boardroom, dismantled her defenses. The story tumbled out in a jumble of exhausted words. The 16-hour double shift at Mercy General, the frantic rush to the airport, the flickering gate signs that blurred into a meaningless mess. She told him about her mother, the minor but terrifying surgery that had been scheduled for tomorrow, the guilt that had gnawed at her for even taking 2 days off. "I am so sorry," she finished, her voice barely a whisper. She gestured weakly at the opulent cabin around them. I'll reimburse you for the fuel. I have savings." A dry, unexpected chuckle escaped him. It transformed his stern face, carving lines of amusement around his eyes. "I doubt you can afford it," he deadpanned, taking a sip from his porcelain coffee cup. The statement wasn't cruel, just a simple, stark fact. He studied her over the rim. "But your honesty is refreshing." The silence that followed was thick, filled with the unspoken rules of two worlds colliding. Theresa, emboldened by a fatigue that stripped away all social filters, finally asked the question burning in her mind. "Aren't you furious? I'd be furious." Donald's gaze drifted to the window, to the endless blanket of clouds below. "I've just spent a week in Geneva surrounded by people who wanted a piece of my company, my money, or my influence. Every smile was a transaction, every handshake a negotiation." He turned back, his gray eyes locking onto hers with an unsettling directness. "You just wanted to see your mother. It's a novel change of pace." What followed was a stilted, then slowly flowing conversation. Awkward small talk about the smoothness of the flight evolved into something more substantial. She found herself telling him about Mr. Henderson, the elderly patient on her ward who smuggled in jelly beans for the night staff, and the heartbreaking gap in his medication because his insurance wouldn't cover it. She spoke of the relentless pace, the emotional weight of holding hands with the scared and the sick, the constant feeling of running on a treadmill that only sped up. To her astonishment, he listened. Truly listened. And then, he shared something in return. Not about wealth or power, but about a different kind of exhaustion. "You speak of burnout as if it's unique to your profession," he mused, swirling the dark liquid in his cup. "I have a different version. It's the burnout of 1,000 business lunches, 100 tech summits, and 1,000,000 fake smiles. It's building something revolutionary, only to watch it become just another commodity to be bought, sold, and argued over by men in suits. I haven't had a conversation that didn't feel like a strategic move in, I can't remember." The revelation hung in the air between them, a bridge built on shared, if different, weariness. The nurse who had nothing, and the billionaire who had everything, both trapped in gilded cages of their own making. The spell was broken by the gentle nudge of descent. They were landing in New York, just for a quick refueling. The real world was reasserting itself. Theresa gathered her resolve, preparing to disembark, to find a bus, to slink back to her life of calculated sacrifices. As the jet rolled to a stop on the private tarmac, Donald stood, his tall frame blocking the aisle to the door. "Before you go," he said, his voice quiet but intent, "I have a proposal." Theresa froze, her hand tightening on the strap of her backpack. "My itinerary for the next week isn't a series of boardrooms, it's a drive, a road trip from here to Colorado. I want you to come with me." The words made no sense. They seemed to hang in the pressurized air, refusing to form a coherent idea. "What?" was all she could manage. "Why?" "Call it billionaire penance for a boarding error," he said, a ghost of that earlier smile touching his lips. "You said you haven't had a real break in years. I told you I haven't had anything feel real in a decade. 5 days, no press, no cameras, no strings, just a trip." He gestured to the terminal outside the window, a gateway back to her predictable life. "You can walk away right now. It's the sane choice. Or you can see a piece of America without a budget or a plan." Her mind, the part of her that was forever the responsible daughter, the reliable nurse, screamed, "No!" This was insanity. This was how people ended up in headlines. But her mother's surgery was delayed by a week. She had the time. She looked at Donald Schwardzeneger, not at his suit or his jet, but at the quiet sincerity in his eyes, the faint echo of a loneliness that mirrored her own. The man before her, for all his unimaginable wealth, looked as adrift as she felt. Her heart, cautious and careful, said no. But her gut, for the first time in years, screamed a reckless, terrifying, thrilling yes. Would you say yes to a once-in-a-lifetime offer from a billionaire stranger? Drop your comment and subscribe if you really want to know what happened. The car was a rocket of cherry red and polished chrome, a 1967 Mustang convertible that looked like it had rolled straight out of a dream. As Donald guided it away from the New York airfield warehouse where it was kept, the morning sun warm on their faces, Theresa felt the last threads of her old life snap in the wind. She was dressed in soft, expensive clothes a silent assistant had procured, cashmere and denim that felt alien against her skin. But as Donald pushed the accelerator and the engine roared to life, the self-consciousness vanished, replaced by a feeling so foreign she almost didn't recognize it. Weightlessness. A laugh burst from her, unexpected and loud, startling even herself. It was the first real one in years, and it was carried away by the Adirondack breeze. For 2 days they existed in a bubble. They ate at greasy spoons where the coffee was bottomless and the pie was homemade. They pulled over to marvel at absurd roadside attractions, a world's largest ball of twine, a museum dedicated to garden gnomes. There were no handlers, no press, no schedules. It was just the open road, the rumble of the engine, and the slowly eroding wall between them. Nashville hit them with a wall of sound and neon. That night, Donald led her, hesitant, into a raucous karaoke bar. "This is part of the experience," he shouted over the noise, his eyes glinting with a challenge. Theresa shook her head, mortified. "I don't sing." "Everyone sings," he countered. "It's just a question of whether they have an audience." He signed her up. When her name, or the fake one he'd given, Tess, was called, her feet felt rooted to the sticky floor. But Donald gave her a gentle push, his expression unreadable. On stage, blinded by the lights, she grasped the microphone. The opening chords of Stand By Me began. She closed her eyes. She sang for the night shifts that felt endless. She sang for the worried families in waiting rooms. She sang for her mother. Her voice, Initially shaky, grew stronger, clear and filled with a soulful warmth she didn't know she possessed. The room's chatter died down. When the last note faded, the applause was thunderous. She stumbled off the stage, her face flushed, her heart hammering. Donald was staring at her, his drink forgotten in his hand. The calculated stoic mask was gone, replaced by pure, unvarnished wonder. "You," he began, then shook his head. "You lied. You absolutely sing." Later, on the quiet street outside their hotel, the buzz of the city a distant hum, he finally spoke, his voice quiet. "I used to write music," he confessed. The words seeming to surprise even him. "In college, before the first startup, before all this." He gestured vaguely, a sweep of his hand that encompassed his entire empire. "It was all I wanted to do." Theresa stopped walking, turning to face him. "What happened?" "Life. Ambition. My brother thought the tech idea was a safer bet." A shadow crossed his face, brief but deep. He was right, financially, but I haven't touched a piano in 10 years. In the silence that followed, a slow song drifted from a nearby bar. Without a word, Donald extended his hand. It wasn't a grand gesture, just a simple, quiet question. Theresa, her body still thrumming with the adrenaline of the stage, placed her hand in his. There, on the sidewalk under a canopy of Tennessee stars, they began to sway. It wasn't a proper dance, just a gentle, rocking motion. His hand was warm on the small of her back, a steady, grounding pressure. Her head fit perfectly against his shoulder. She could feel the steady thud of his heart through his shirt, a rhythm more intimate than any song. The air between them crackled, a live wire of something unspoken and potent. Theresa's breath caught. She felt him tense too, his fingers flexing slightly against her back. The moment stretched, fragile and immense. The desire to look up, to close the scant inches between them was a physical pull. But then, simultaneously, they pulled back. The spell was broken. The billionaire and the nurse, remembering who they were. "We should get some sleep," Donald said, his voice suddenly formal, the wall sliding back into place. "Right. Big day tomorrow," Theresa replied, her own voice too bright. But as they walked separately to their adjoining rooms, Theresa saw it. Not the formidable tech titan, but a man who had traded his songs for spreadsheets, haunted by a path not taken. And Donald saw not just a tired nurse, but a woman with a spine of steel and a hidden luminous talent who had spent so long caring for others she'd forgotten she had a self-worth discovering. The chemistry was there, blooming wild and undeniable by the roadside. But for now, their hearts, so expertly hidden for so long, remained cautiously, protectively, locked away. The red rocks of Sedona rose from the desert floor like ancient, slumbering giants, bathed in the deep ochre light of a dying sun. Donald turned the Mustang onto a winding dirt track, dust pluming behind them, until a low-slung cabin of weathered timber appeared, nestled perfectly into the landscape. It was remote, silent in a way that felt profound, not empty. "No five-star hotels tonight," Donald said, killing the engine. The ensuing quiet was a physical presence. "I own this place. No one knows about it." Inside, it was all rough-hewn beams, a stone fireplace, and a breathtaking wall of windows framing the vast, starlit desert. The pressure of Nashville, the unspoken tension of their almost kiss, evaporated in the sheer, majestic peace. They cooked a simple meal together, the silence between them now comfortable, filled only with the crackle of sautéing vegetables and the comfortable clink of pans. Later, Donald built a fire in the outdoor pit. The desert cold was sharp, but the flames cast a warm, dancing glow on their faces. Huddled in thick wool blankets, they stared into the embers. The universe stretched infinitely above them. It was Theresa who broke the silence, her voice soft. My mom worked double shifts as a waitress. I'd fall asleep to the sound of her rubbing her feet with menthol cream. She gave a small, sad smile. I became a nurse because I saw what a body breaking down looked like. I promised myself I'd have an easier life. She barked a short, bitter laugh. Turns out I just found a more respectable way to break myself. Donald didn't look at her, his profile etched in firelight. We all have our reasons for running, he murmured. The logs shifted, sending a shower of sparks into the indigo night. He took a slow breath as if steeling himself. His name was Daniel, my twin. The words hung in the cold air, heavy and final. Leukemia. He was 24. Brilliant. Funny. The good one. Theresa's breath caught. She stayed perfectly still, bearing witness. I watched technology fail him. I watched systems, slow, stupid, archaic systems, delay treatments, misplace records. I felt so powerless. His jaw tightened. So after he was gone, I built something that wouldn't fail. I founded Schwardzeneger Medical AI to create the diagnostic and logistical tools that might have saved him. It was my grief, made into code. The revelation landed with the force of a physical blow. The reclusive tech billionaire wasn't just a genius. He was a grieving brother, building a monument to his loss. His entire empire, a fortress constructed around a single, aching wound. It's the first thing I think about when I wake up, he whispered, finally turning to look at her. His eyes were raw but stripped bare of all their calculated coolness. And the last. Until this trip. The air between them thickened, charged with a vulnerability more intimate than any touch. This, he said, gesturing to the cabin, the fire, to her. Driving, laughing, listening to you sing. For the first time in years, the noise in my head is quiet. I feel grounded. And I don't know what to do with that. Theresa's heart hammered against her ribs. This was the pivot, the moment the fantasy threatened to become real. Her voice was barely a whisper. I'm scared, Donald. Of me? Of this, she corrected, her gaze unwavering. Of what this is. It started as a mistake, but now I'm scared of what it could become, and I'm terrified of what happens when it ends. They didn't move. No hand was held. No kiss was exchanged. The few feet of space between them might as well have been a canyon, filled with the ghosts of his brother and the shadow of her responsibilities. Yet, in that space, an unmistakable understanding passed between them, a recognition of shared scars, of mutual loneliness, of a connection that had sunk far deeper than either had intended. The fire burned lower. The billion stars above watched, silent. They had confessed their deepest truths, and the world hadn't ended. It had just become infinitely more complicated and more beautiful. Could something that started as a mistake become the most meaningful connection of their lives? Colorado unfolded around them in a grandeur of jagged peaks and pine forests that made the desert's silence feel like a whisper. But as they wound their way toward Colorado Springs, the sky, which had been a flawless cerulean, began to bruise. Great, swollen clouds gathered, blotting out the sun and turning the air thick and charged. We might not make it to town, Donald noted, his hands firm on the wheel as the first fat raindrops splattered against the windshield. Theresa just smiled. I like the rain. It started in earnest then, not a gentle shower, but a torrential downpour that turned the world into a gray, roaring curtain. The windshield wipers beat a frantic, useless rhythm. Visibility dropped to mere feet. Donald guided the Mustang onto the shoulder, the tires crunching on wet gravel. Through the deluge, a lone sign glowed like a beacon. Maggie's Diner. "Run for it!" he shouted over the hammering rain. She just grinned, a wild, exhilarated look in her eyes, and pushed her door open. They sprinted, hand in hand, through the punishing cold water. Icy streams soaked through Theresa's hair and trickled down her back. By the time they burst through the diner's door, a bell jangling overhead, they were gasping, dripping puddles onto the worn linoleum floor. The place was empty, save for a lone cook who nodded from behind the counter before disappearing into the kitchen. They collapsed into a vinyl booth by the large plate glass window, their breath coming in ragged pants that slowly turned into laughter. It was the kind of helpless, breathless laughter that comes from pure, unadulterated release. "We look like drowned rats," Theresa managed, pushing sopping strands of hair from her face. "Speak for yourself," Donald retorted, though his usually impeccable hair was plastered to his forehead. He shrugged out of his ruined suit jacket just as a waitress appeared with 2 thick mugs of coffee. "On the house," she said with a warm smile. "Storm's a real one tonight." They sat in comfortable silence then, wrapped in the warmth of the diner and the steam from their mugs, and watched the tempest rage outside. The world was a blur of wind-whipped trees and silver rain, but inside, it was safe. It was quiet. Theresa watched the storm, a profound sense of peace settling over her. The constant, low-grade anxiety of bills, of shifts, of her mother's health. It was all miles away, washed clean by the Colorado rain. For the first time since she could remember, she felt utterly, completely free. Not a nurse, not a daughter, not a mistake-maker. Just Theresa. Donald watched her. He saw the way the warm light softened the tired lines around her eyes, the way she cradled the mug in her hands as if it were a sacred thing. He saw the quiet wonder on her face as she stared out at the chaos, completely unguarded. There was no agenda in her, no calculation. She was just present. And for a man whose life was a series of negotiations and projected outcomes, her simple authenticity was the most disarming force he had ever encountered. Her gaze shifted from the window to him, and she found him already looking. The laughter was gone, replaced by something deeper, more potent. The air between them, once charged with the storm, was now charged with them. "I don't want this to end," she whispered, the words a confession pulled from her very soul. "I don't want to go back to my real life just yet." "Neither do I," he replied, his voice low and rough. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. His skin was warm, his touch sure. But we both know real life isn't on autopilot. It was the acknowledgement of the inevitable that broke the last barrier. He stood, gently pulling her to her feet, and led her away from the table to the quiet space by the jukebox, out of the waitress's line of sight. The storm continued its symphony against the glass. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the lines of her jaw. His eyes searched hers, asking a silent question. Her answer was a slight, almost imperceptible nod and the closing of her eyes. The kiss was not one of frantic passion, but of slow, profound discovery. It was soft and real, a gentle sealing of all the words they had shared in the desert and all the feelings they had been too afraid to name. It tasted of coffee and rain and a shocking, breathtaking rightness. Theresa's hands came up to rest on his chest, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart beneath the wet fabric of his shirt. Time didn't stop, but it slowed, stretching into a perfect, endless moment where the only things that existed were the two of them and the storm. When they finally broke apart, foreheads resting together, their breaths mingling, the world outside seemed a little less fierce. "We boarded this ride by mistake," she whispered, her voice trembling. He kissed her forehead, a soft promise of a touch. "But I don't want to get off." "Neither do I." The call came as they were sharing a quiet breakfast overlooking Central Park. The world, so vast and free just days before, shrank to the size of her phone screen. Theresa listened, her responses reduced to soft monosyllabic affirmations. "I understand. Tomorrow? Yes. I'll be there." She ended the call. The silence in the hotel suite was deafening. Donald watched her, his own coffee growing cold. He didn't need to ask. He saw the shift in her posture, the way the light that had kindled in her eyes over the past week was suddenly banked by the heavy clouds of duty. "My mom," she said, her voice thin. "The surgeon had a cancellation. They moved her surgery up. It's tomorrow." He simply nodded, his expression unreadable. "Then we fly you back today." There was no hesitation, no attempt to make her choose. It was the man who had built an empire out of logistical efficiency, now using that power to honor her commitment. The gesture was more loving than any plea to stay could have been. The flight to New York on his jet was shrouded in a heavy, poignant silence. They sat side by side, his hand covering hers, but words felt like trivial things that could only cheapen the raw, unspoken ache between them. The adventure was over. The dream interrupted. At JFK, he didn't delegate. He personally walked her through the bustling terminal to her commercial gate for Charlotte, a billionaire in a cashmere coat navigating the crowds for a nurse in a simple sweater. The contrast was stark, a visual reminder of the worlds they inhabited. The final call for her flight echoed through the concourse, a harsh severance. "Theresa," he said, turning to her. His composure was a thin veneer over a depth of emotion that made her heart clench. He took her hand and pressed something cold and metallic into her palm. She looked down. It was a simple, heavy key. "It's for the cabin in Sedona," he said, his voice low, "for when you need peace. Or—" He paused, his gray eyes holding hers with an intensity that stole her breath. "Or when you want something more." Theresa tried to summon a brave smile, but it fractured as hot tears blurred her vision, turning the terminal lights into starbursts. She curled her fingers around the key, its edges biting into her palm, a tangible piece of their intangible week. "This started as a mistake," she whispered, her voice thick. "But it's changed me. I don't think I can ever go back to just being the person I was before I boarded your plane." He reached out and gently wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb, his touch a brand she feared would fade. "Me too," he admitted, the words a raw confession. This was the first trip in a decade that didn't feel like a business transaction. He gave her a look of profound, aching understanding. Maybe all great things begin with the unexpected. It was the perfect thing to say. It honored the chaos of their beginning and left the future, terrifyingly, beautifully, open. She rose on her toes and pressed a soft, final kiss to his lips, a seal on a promise not yet defined. Then, with the key clutched tightly in her hand, she turned and walked down the jet bridge without looking back, afraid that if she saw him standing there, she would never have the strength to leave. Donald watched her until she disappeared, the space she left behind feeling vaster than all the empty rooms in all his properties combined. Back in Charlotte, the fluorescent lights of Mercy General were a brutal welcome. The smells of antiseptic and bleach replaced the scent of pine and desert rain. Theresa moved through her shifts, the same competent, caring nurse, but something was different. She slept better. She dreamed again. In the quiet moments, she would open her locker and look at the key, a sliver of metal that proved her adventure was real. It was a wild, beautiful memory, but the door had not closed. He had left it open, and he was waiting on the other side. Will she leave this behind as just a wild memory, or come back to it one day? The world had snapped back into its familiar, relentless rhythm. The scent of desert rain and pine was replaced by the sterile tang of antiseptic. The roar of a Mustang's engine was a distant memory, drowned out by the beeping of monitors and the squeak of her sneakers on polished hospital floors. Charlotte was a palette of grays and blues after the vibrant reds and golds of the road. Theresa was back. She worked her double shifts, sipped bitter coffee at midnight, and held patients' hands. She was the same nurse, yet entirely remade. The crushing weight of her responsibilities felt different now. Not lighter in mass, but easier to carry. The burnout was no longer a terminal diagnosis, but a manageable condition. She found herself humming "Stand By Me" in the supply closet, a secret smile touching her lips. She kept the key. It lived in the small metal locker that held her stethoscope and spare scrubs, a solid, cool piece of metal among the soft fabrics. It was a talisman, a promise. Every time her fingers brushed against it, she felt the ghost of a campfire's warmth on her skin. And every day, her phone would light up. Donald. How's your mom? Donald. The sky in New York is gray. It made me think of the Colorado storm. Donald. Hope your shift is kind, short, meaningful. A tether to that other world, proving it hadn't vanished. He was giving her space, but making sure she never felt alone. Her mother's surgery was a success. The relief was profound, a cornerstone of her old life firmly set back in place. One less thing to carry. That evening, her own shift ended unexpectedly early. As she walked out of the hospital's automatic doors, the air was unseasonably warm. She looked up. The sky was a breathtaking canvas of deep violet and fiery orange. The clouds streaked like watercolor, a perfect, vivid echo of a Sedona sunset. It felt like a sign. Not a dramatic, heaven-sent portent, but a gentle, firm nudge from the universe. The path was clear. Her heart hammering a rhythm that felt both new and ancient. She didn't go to her car. She stood right there, under the painted sky, and pulled the key from her locker bag. Its weight was a comfort. She found his name in her contacts and pressed call. He answered before the first ring could even finish, as if his phone had been a live wire in his hand. Theresa. His voice was a low rush of relief, of anticipation. She took a shaky breath, the sound of his name erasing the last of her doubt. Hi. There was a smile in his tone, a certainty that made her knees weak. Ready? For what? She asked, her own smile breaking through, breathless and free. For the rest of the story. That was all it took. This time, there was no exhaustion, no confusion. When she boarded the flight he'd arranged, her steps were sure. She found her seat, a window seat, and looked out at the tarmac. The jet engines began to whine, a song of power and potential. As the plane lifted into the sky, chasing the last of the sunset, Theresa Morgan didn't feel a trace of panic. Only a profound, thrilling peace. She was no longer running from her life. She was flying by choice toward it. She was finally, undeniably, living. Thank you for watching to the end. I believe you enjoyed it. We have a lot of other interesting stories like this lined up for you already, so click the image showing on your screen to watch the next. Don't forget to subscribe.